Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Control Society Speaker Series. I'm Ezekiel Dixon-Roman from the School of Social Policy and Practice, and I co-curate this speaker series with my awesome colleague, Jessa Lingle of the Annenberg School for Communication. Control Societies is sponsored by a Provost Excellence Through Diversity Fund grant, the School for Social Policy and Practice, the Annenberg School for Communication, the Center for Media at Risk, and the Price Lab for Digital Humanities. And I actually want to pause for a moment and just sort of add just a couple additional comments. Part of the reason why Jessa and I have come together to pull this speaker series together is to try to open up a discourse and dialogue on campus around critical media and data studies. And so we have been really happy and overwhelmingly just excited about the response that we've been getting the past couple of years, and are really happy to see all of you here today. This year, Jessa and I decided to do an abbreviated version, so rather than doing 8 speakers this year, we're doing 4, mainly because we both have our own different configurations of leave this year, so just to lighten it up a bit. But back in November, we were able to co-sponsor with the Center for Media at Risk, Wendy Chun's talk on the influence of eugenics and logics of homophily on machine learning and what sorts of political interventions are needed or even possible. Next week, we have Zach Bloss, and in April, Cindy Takobi. Today, I have the esteemed privilege to introduce you all to Patricia Clough. But before I do that, before I introduce her, I'd like to provide a few words to help ground what this speaker series is about. If you all have come in the past, I've generally done this with the first speaker of the year, just so we have a sense for what Control Societies even is, whether we agree with the concept or not. And so as I realize not everyone may be familiar with the concept, let alone what even is meant by the word control. Control societies is a concept that French philosopher Gilles Deleuze developed in his 1992 essay, Postscripts on Societies of Control. This is Deleuze's rethinking of Michel Foucault's disciplinary societies in order to account for the increasingly more networked societies that since World War II have begun to move beyond the organization of vast spaces of enclosure of disciplinary societies. In control societies, discipline is no longer based on the corporal disciplining and shaping of bodies via the awareness of the possibility of being visible by authorities of surveillance. Control societies are characterized by the hypervisibility across time and space and the regulating of movement and acts via modulating mechanisms through time and space. As Deleuze states in Control Societies, quote, the numerical language of control is made of codes that mark access to information or reject it. If disciplinary societies might be characterized by parametric modeling and population census data, and perhaps also associated with Foucauldian analyses of how such measures structure society, the latter is characterized by a more invasive becoming statistic in which social metrics are actively mutated along with that which they measure. In Deleuzian terms, this shift corresponds to a shift from the individual to a more environmental system of individuals, a term that designates the multiplicities of flowing traits and tensors that segment and differentiate all modernist conceptions of the individual and society. Borrowing from William Burroughs, Deleuze's conception of control is not about influence or restraint, or constraint for that matter, but rather a logic, or following Alex Galloway, a protocol that gives the impression of freedom while one's choices are being modulated for them. When we consider our vast amounts of digital technologies that have become taken for granted forms of quotidian social life, it becomes quite easy to see what Deleuze was rather prophetically speaking to almost 30 years ago. More importantly, the socio-technologies that make up our digital world are undergirded by an affective politics and even population racism, to borrow a term from our speaker today, that is less interested in the individual and population statistics of biopolitics and more interested in the derivative and recombinable forms of operating in the multiple time spaces of capital. Each of the speakers throughout this year-long speaker series will be engaging in questions pertaining to the potential or ongoing implications of control societies, doing work on the intersections of computation, governmentality, with a particular focus on the ways in which difference is being reconfigured, reproduced, and/or reconstituted in and through the computational acts of digital architectures. This brings me to have the esteemed privilege to introduce our renowned leading scholar of ethnography, our renowned speaker and leading scholar of ethnography, affect theory, and media studies, Patricia Clough. Patricia Ticineto, am I saying that correct? Okay. Clough is a professor of sociology and women's studies and currently is teaching in performance studies at NYU. She is the author of Autoaffection, Unconscious Thought in the Age of Teletechnology, editor of The Affective Turn, and co-editor of Beyond Biopolitics, Essays in the Governance of Life and Death, and most recently, The User Unconscious, Affect, Media, and Measure. In her now widely regarded article, The New Empiricisms, she argues with George Steinmetz that post-World War II United States produced an epistemological unconscious dominated by methodological positivism, prioritizing the instrumental reason of quantitative sociology. In addition, she also describes how the societal shifts by way of the digitization of society has enabled cultural critics to engage in an empiricism, a Deleuzian transcendental empiricism that examines not the given event or outcome, but rather the genetic conditions of external relations that produce the event's emergence, the study not of what is, but of its becoming. Clough argues that cultural critics have begun to study these processes of becoming from external relations with the affect and intensities of the body via visceral perception and preconscious affect. This article became the inspiration of at least one special issue that I know of, and there probably are others out there that I'm not aware of, titled New Materialisms, New Empiricisms, which is in 2016 Cultural Studies Critical Methodologies. I also had the privilege to have edited one of her articles for a special issue I co-guest edited for Cultural Studies Critical Methodologies, and this was another one. In this article, Rethinking Race, Calculation, Quantification, and Measure, Clough illustrates a cultural studies of numeracy from a media studies perspective. Her focus is on new regimes of calculation and both the limits and possibilities of mobilizing critical theory to make sense of such shifts. She uses Roderick Ferguson's Foucauldian call for reordering of things in the academy to get at the rethinking of quantitative inquiry. She's especially interested in race and the twists and turns of how the institutionalizing of the interdisciplines of area studies in higher education functioned to manage difference. In almost a cautionary tale, she pays particular attention to parallels of the institutionalization of the interdisciplines of area studies with the emerging interdisciplines between the humanities, the arts, and the social sciences, and that of the mathematical sciences, computer science, digital studies, and the natural sciences. By elaborating both sociological and media studies disciplinary perspectives, something beyond biopolitics and neoliberalism becomes thinkable. Of course, these are just a few examples of the sharp and important interventions that Patricia Clough has made in affect theory, measurement, and media studies, and other areas of work and scholarship. Today, we have the privilege to be hearing from her give a talk on the user unconscious, subjectivity, embodiment, and datafication. And with that, I'll move out the way and give the floor to Patricia.
So first, is that good? Before I forget to, let me thank all those departments and all the people that have brought me here and have and will feed me later and all those good things. I thank you. Pretty freaky listening to Ezekiel. I thought, whoa. I kind of don't remember thinking all those thoughts, actually. So I think I'm starting back a little further than where I began, and where you began in the talk. And I'm grateful I didn't choose the piece I thought I might write, called What is the Losers Control Society? Because then I wouldn't have. But I do have to say, just quickly, because my friend and colleague Heather Love is here, and she'll get it more than some of you will, that I published my first book in 1992. That was Ends of Ethnography. And the last chapter was on Irving Goffman, which I know you have some interest in. He was here, I think, right? Yeah. And on computer technology. I was already thinking about computers way back then. But after I was done with it, I was at a library, an academic library, just kind of hanging out, thinking, I'm done. And I picked up a journal, October. It was 1992. And there in that journal was those 5 amazing, because it is 5 amazing pages, postscript on societies of control. So reading that in 1992 has really affected me for the rest of my life. I don't know when everybody else started reading it, but so I'll say something about that a little bit, but I don't know if I'm talking about, I don't know what I'm talking about exactly. I guess I'm just going to tell you a bunch of little thoughts I'm having about things related, I hope, to what you're thinking about. Ezekiel forgot to mention that I spend most of my time now teaching, yes, at performance studies, but really more time being a psychoanalyst. So there's a little bit of psychoanalysis coming your way. That's why I said, I don't know, it's way before where you put me, in thinking anyway. Okay. As you know, or don't, psychoanalysis is not now part of critical theorizing as much as it was in earlier years of feminist theory, film theory, media studies. And of course, post-structuralism and the ideological criticisms related to post-structuralism, post-colonial theory, queer theory, critical race theory, even if in all of these psychoanalysis was critically engaged against the grain, nonetheless, it was engaged. I think there's some new interest in psychoanalysis, but it's been a little while. But with the new materialisms, object-oriented ontology, speculative realisms, animal studies, environmental studies, process philosophies, and affect studies, the human subject or the privileged subject of Western discourse has been displaced. Different than the post-structural deconstruction of the subject, the more recent displacement or decentering of the subject turns instead to the agencies, the liveliness, or the capacities of the other than human, non-human animals, objects, the environment, the planetary. The move away from psychoanalysis is not surprising then, since psychoanalysis would seem to be centered on the human subject, especially the privileged white heterosexual male subject, if not in practice, then surely in much psychoanalytic theory. As a psychoanalyst, as well as a media studies scholar, cultural critic, and would-be philosopher, I nonetheless have been drawn to what might be thought of as the other than human of the unconscious. And here, I mean to extend what in psychoanalysis already is the decentering of the intentional subject through the inhabiting of the subject of unconscious processes understood to involve objects, and that is the term in psychoanalysis. Objects that are thought of as unconsciously internalized aspects of the parenting figures that have been introjected or implanted into the infant in becoming a subject, and which can be projected by the infant having become subject into other subjects, most notably later in the processes of transference and countertransference. So we all know, I hope, that psychoanalysis was the first to undermine the intentional subject by saying you think you know what you're thinking and doing, but you don't. These mystical actions, these unconscious transmissions without transmitting intentionalities or cognitions would seem to presume a transmitting medium that affords the passing through skin, seemingly opening the body to the other or to information in transference and countertransference and things like that. Although psychoanalytically speaking, the objects of the unconscious are not yet subjects, we should note that they nonetheless are forceful, effective, their allure internal to the objects themselves. They sort of inform everything we do, and it's not easy to get rid of them, if you've ever tried, and very expensive. Their allure internal to the objects themselves, and thus the objects of psychoanalysis might be said to be mediatic, radiating energy and draw. But in psychoanalysis, none of this is thought through in terms of the other than human, because all the objects of interest in psychoanalysis are thought either to be human and/or they eventually will become subjects or humanized, that is made meaningful by other subjects, for example, mothers, parents, or analysts. For me, the user unconscious is my attempt to rethink these objects of unconscious processes in relationship to datafication and digital media and the recent ontological turns in cultural criticism, philosophy, media studies, scholarship, in order to rethink the subject and the body. I'm trying to remember where I thought I was going to say something. I might not. Of course, philosophers, cultural critics, and media studies scholars have discussed the unconscious in relationship to digital technology. Nigel Thrift famously took up thought in the age of teletechnology, as I had discussed it in my book, Autoaffection. He became famous for that, and I did not then, anyway. In fact, I had sent a paper into Theory, Culture, and Society, which they did accept finally, but they sent it back and said, you should read Nigel Thrift. And when I read Nigel Thrift, it said, Patricia Clough in Autoaffection, which I thought was really, only the Academy. He used the term technological unconscious, which of course was so much nicer than teletechnology, right? So I guess he deserved it. The technological unconscious, which Catherine Hales would reconceive as the technological non-conscious, while Thrift already had suggested that with digital media, the unconscious was operating at a pre-personal substrate of unconsidered anticipations that connects us to digital media and other users. Hales would emphasize that digital media operate through, quote, somatic responses, haptic feedback, gestural interactions, and a wide variety of our other activities that are habitual and repetitive and that therefore fall below the threshold of conscious awareness. It's very interesting. You should note how much the body is here. We don't always think of digital technology. In fact, we usually think of it as not embodied. But most of the early thinking, or not so early, was about the relationship of the digital to affect, which is bodily, around consciousness. So we've caught on to how it was not, we weren't going to be conscious, but we've somehow not always thought through the body here. And I noticed habitual and repetitive, which maybe Wendy Chung had mentioned because it's her, it's her angle on digital. not a matter of the conscious or the unconscious. The non-conscious referred to here is a matter of affect. Affect, not feeling or emotion, but non-conscious somatic responses. Hales would focus on the way code works through bodily affect while dissociating affect from consciousness. Hales concluded, we are suffering traumas of code, by which she meant the traumas of what is felt but not known. While the discourse on affect took media studies scholars, philosophers, and cultural studies critics away from cognition and things like artificial intelligence, with their increasing engagement with datafication, or what's called big data, the thought of the cognitive capacities of digital media has become important, and indeed, more recently, Hales would use the term cognitive, non-conscious, shifting away from trauma of the human user to recognize the non-conscious cognition operative in digital computational technologies. So I hope you see, if you haven't already traveled this road, that from the move from the body and the impact of digital on the human has shifted to a non-conscious cognition that belongs to the digital. And I'm not sure where the human is. The non-conscious cognition operative in digital computational technologies, where decisions are made, for example, in high-frequency market trading, online dating, Amazon purchasing, all through algorithms working cognitively below or before human consciousness and cognition. So that part's still there. Thus, Hale concludes that cognition, quoting, cognition is much broader than human thinking, and that other animals as well as technical devices cognize and interpret all the time, leading her beyond the human to the other than the human. As she put it, part of the contemporary turn toward the non-human is the realization that an object need not be alive or conscious in order to function as a cognitive agent. No doubt, the most recent turns in philosophy, media studies scholarship, and cultural criticism, such as object-oriented philosophy, speculative realism, and the new materialisms that take up objects, non-human animals, and environments seen as agentic, if not lively, are intertwined with digital media and computational technologies, given that these technologies not only are further decentering human privilege, they also are becoming the very infrastructure of governance and economy, heavily demanding a reassembling of the social, to use Latour's terms, recognizing what media critic Ben Bratton proposes when he argues that this is not a matter of putting technology into sociality, but rather to understand technology as the armature of the social itself. It might be good to say this here, that so Deleuze's Control Society, Postscript and Social, the 5-page piece in October, appears in English in 92, published in French in 90. 2 years earlier, in 86 and 88, respectively, Deleuze writes a book titled Foucault, and it's on Foucault. And it's a tremendously interesting book. To think that it's 2 years before the postscript, because there's nothing like the postscript in it, but who knows what he was thinking about. What it's really about is the movement in Foucault's work from archaeology, knowledge, archive, to the diagram. And the diagram, especially, if you think of something like, and Deleuze did, and it's a word that Foucault used, thinking of 19th century institutions like the mental health hospital and all those that he would call disciplinary institutions. And what he meant by diagram was something well, you should read Deleuze on it, it's like, whoa. But it's something abstracted, an abstract machine that you only see in the realization of various institutions, but panopticism might be seen in all of them. And as Ezekiel explained it, is focused on the body, the disciplining of the body. Whereas controlled societies, although 2 years later Deleuze never uses the term, he's really proposing, perhaps, if we kept that term, a new diagram. Only 2 years after. But when you're reading, and it would be fun to do this with you, but I won't, when you're reading how Deleuze describes Foucault's diagram, because don't forget about Deleuze, he reads somebody and you think, oh, that's okay, but he's actually moving you a little bit by little bit away from that thinker to his own thinking. And so there's a quote or two, but if you read Deleuze's description of the diagram, it belongs very specifically, I think, to controlled societies, or it's the beginning of knowing they're coming. It's interesting to think, by the way, that such a concept like diagram might really fit the 19th century, or what Foucault called the long 19th century, all the way to 1950s, post-World War II, cybernetic, blah, blah, blah. You may not really find this term as useful, even though it's described as if there'll always be diagrams. I don't know. It's an interesting thought. But I wanted to say that somewhere, so there it is. For Hales, so I guess what I'm trying to do is work out that diagram. For Hales, the wild extension of non-conscious cognition in the becoming ubiquitous of digital media and computational technologies encourages a recognition of the ongoing interaction between the digitalized cognitive non-conscious and the conscious unconscious mode. But there is no, she says that, but there is no mention of the effect on the human body, in human body in this ongoing interaction between digitalized cognitive non-conscious and the human conscious unconscious mode. So there's no rethinking of consciousness or unconscious, at least as far as she goes. In conceiving the user unconscious, I have been concerned to rethink the human body in the context of datafication, or what I take to be the sociality of the becoming ubiquitous of digital media and computation technologies, their analytic capacities functioning below consciousness or at the non-conscious scale. In returning to the body, I also want to return to subjectivity and the unconscious of the user, all in the aftermath of the decentering of the human and the subject in current philosophical terms that are also in the wake of datafication. I'm not sure everybody will agree, but all those philosophies, to my mind, come out of the presence of datafication, whether they know it or not. I will have more to say about all that, but I want first to address what I mean by sociality in turning your attention to the work of Luciana Parisi, whose writing I have followed since I first read Heat Death in 2000, in which she and her co-author, Tiziana Terranova, I think said everything that should be said, described the body as organism as only one formulation or image of the body, one which befits the disciplinary society of late 19th century industrial capitalism, where, quote, where the fluids circulating outside and between bodies are folded onto themselves in order to be channeled within the solid walls of the organism, self, subject. Even Judith Butler never realizes when she's doing her thing on bodies that she maintains the notion of organism and without consideration. Sure, it's how we live, but what the heck. Allowing for or informing the liberal configuration of the separation of the factory, the home, the private and public spheres, the economy, and governance. So in that arrangement, right, private and public spheres, economy and state, there's a notion of a body. There's also, we'll see in a minute, a notion of energy, of course. This is Marx. So separation of the factory, the home, the private public sphere, the economy and the governance, Europe and the other. Now, Marx's understanding of labor, for instance, has always presumed this arrangement, this liberal arrangement, as have so many of the movements for rights that we have known. These also are about the liberal state / neoliberal, but liberal state, its rights and obligations. For Freud, too, this arrangement, this diagram is presumed and includes a conception of the body as organism. And it's very interesting to think of those, not just that they were assumed, but Deleuze always says, a diagram starts out flat and thin, and then people fill it in. So you can put Marx in there, you can put Freud in there as thickening this notion of that particular diagram, the 19th century one. Okay, conception of the body, okay, as organ, which, as Parisi and Terranova put it, is organized, this body, for reproduction within a thermodynamic cycle of capital accumulation and expenditure. So you know that for Marx, labor power was built on the idea that you could have on thermodynamics, that energy, the whole abstraction about energy. So you could talk about it in terms of the same energy being used by bodies and then needing more energy. And Freud, too, Freud's whole notion of energy was thermodynamic. So it's organized for reproduction within thermodynamic cycle of capital accumulation and expenditure as the body is trained to work and reproduce. If this is the body of the 19th century liberal industrial capitalist political economy, what is the body today? The body in the context of datafication and information, what also has been described as an affect economy or an aesthetic capitalism. In the second decade of the 21st century, there was a growing sense that it was the circulation of affect or affective capacities that had become central to capitalism and required thinking affect outside the organism, speculatively speaking, as operative at every scale of matter energy. Now, I don't know what you know. I don't know what you know, period, but I don't know what you know about this. I wish I did. It's a very important period in theory. So I don't know how much it got read, where people rethought information theory all the way back to the beginning of cybernetics and information theory, right? Because it was a kind of change going on about what to think about matter, energy, information. So physicists that usually use thermodynamics as a major theory started using information as a theory, thermodynamics as a special case of information, or informing matter, or matter self-informing. Whenever you get the self thing, like self-producing, self-informing, there's a sort of auto-affection there. There's an affective capacity that is able to affect itself. Deleuze goes on and on about that in the Foucault book, Drawing on Foucault. He uses the word auto-affection. I didn't know that when I used that term, actually. Which is too bad, because it was a Derridian term too. Okay, so I'm going to start. There was a growing sense that it was a circulation of affect or capacities, intensities, information society, individuals needing to develop their capacities, sell their capacities, endless stuff like that. You not only know it, you live it, maybe difficult. Effective energy that had become central to capitalism that required rethinking affect outside the organism, speculatively speaking, operative at every scale of matter energy. Certainly Masumi's great piece on affect included that notion of the different scales of matter energy, while also recognizing that for affect economy, the body as organism trained for work or reproduction is no longer needed or only needed for the creation of surplus value or value, nor is the So I want to put my finger there, still with me, because, there are people still laboring, just like, you could almost do a straight marks on them, and we count on them. But from financial capital what produces wealth, or maybe we have to think of what the word surplus value means, or a surplus is usually not about that. It is not about the laboring body. And it isn't about production, as Randy Martin, who you mentioned, would say. It is how production is done now. It is circulation. And Marx almost knew something like that. The body is organism trained for worth of value, nor is the homeostasis sinking thermodynamic system a good way to think of capitalism or the state in face of the productivity of networks where volatility is productive. You know about volatility. Financial markets is a good way to think of volatility. It's absolutely essential to the making of wealth. Otherwise, it's not worth betting and playing. So we think of volatility, or in information theory, it could be noise, because it's only when you have noise that you see something's new, like information. So noise under Shannon and Weaver become a good thing. It's entropy in the thermodynamic equation, bad thing. But it's so amazing they made a minus into a plus. I don't know how that really works, but yeah. Capitalism's in face of the productivity of networks where volatility is productive. That is to say, where the entropy negative in thermodynamic theory has become noise or chaos, remember all those theories, which is positive or productive in information theory. After all, we only notice information against noise, so that in capitalism, noise also has become productive of more information, more volatility, the volatility of an effective force in forming of matter energy at every scale. Do not, Patricia, read the example you're dying to read about the president here. Okay, I won't. Reimagining the body in because, talk about offering volatility to every scale of matter. Reimagining the body in relationship to effective capitalism also means noting the ongoing transformation of that liberal configuration of the separate public and private spheres, factory and home, nation and economy, Europe and the other. While cultural critics and media studies scholars and philosophers were noticing the changes in the liberal configuration, either as neoliberalism or as control society, there also was a growth of a new field or fields around the digital, which you were mentioning that I wrote in that essay. Data studies, studies of algorithms, studies of platforms, studies of algorithmic government, etc. And at this time, I would find Parisi's more recent work on algorithms. At first, what was startling about Parisi's take on algorithms was her insistence on going against the grain of the easy linking of algorithms and algorithmic governance and finance with first-order or even second-order cybernetic control, a matter of a reductive quantification. So she's not going in that direction. Instead, Parisi would add to Hale's take on digitalized non-conscious cognition what Parisi would describe as the computationally open or the incomputable. It is the incomputable, immanent to the algorithm itself. Immanent to the algorithm itself. That's why Parisi for a minute liked object-oriented ontology, literally for a minute, because she wanted to talk about the algorithm as an object that had activity in itself, right? As they were talking about objects. That allows algorithms to learn from their ongoing operation, to reprogram their parameters, changing the rules in real time, or what is called machine learning. And I wish I could do a long thing here about the difference between something working based on the last thing that happened, or a statistical finding, and something that starts up again with a new parameter that is really speculative. Nobody's really quite sure. When I say no one, I say even the people that are making these things, what is in the parameter that allows, and you'll see what I'm going to say about that, allows the algorithm to do things other than the initial steps provided. It is the incomputable immanent to the algorithm itself that allows algorithms to learn from their ongoing operation, to reprogram their parameters, changing the rules in real time, or what is called machine learning. As Parisi would explain it, in the algorithm, each compression of information produces an excess, or patternless information, or the incomputable, that can operate as a speculative activator of new algorithmic behavior, those are her words, or to a growth of information beyond beginning instructions. Growth of information beyond beginning instructions. In her turn to the capacity of the algorithm, it's really interesting because for a long time I talked completely to myself, and it remains so. I wanted to explain that affect is something that if you modulate affect, you make more affect. I wanted to try to understand that in terms of capitalism, what it would really mean to say that affect was productive of a surplus. But I don't know. But here it is again, I think. In her turn to the capacity of algorithms to learn or increase information beyond starting instructions, Parisi would no longer focus on an image of the body, as she did with Terra Nova, or merely on affect, if affect is thought in terms of an organism, or even in terms of the effective informing of matter energy at every scale, although she had talked about all of those things at some point. Engaging instead, most recently, in the incomputable immanent algorithms as a matter of speculative thought, Parisi now proposes that along with issues of affect and matter and energy, still important, we must give a new image to thought, quote, as non-human or non-biologically bound to any organism. Thought as non-human and not bound to any biological organism. She goes further to argue that the socially mediated way of thinking, given with the agencies of algorithms in their use of data, must lead us to rethink thinking across the board. And she suggests we do so in terms of pragmatism and the logic of abduction beyond induction or deduction. Cybernetics, I studied cybernetics in the early 70s by accident, and they were already way into abduction. They didn't go near computers, so it's just that, the computer was that huge thing with the cards, so that's how long ago. But they were thinking things like that. They could imagine what was coming. Parisi's turn to pragmatism is a philosophical move, a move through the speculative aspects of Gilles Deleuze's work, Alfred North Whitehead's, and finally, Charles Sanders Peirce, who proposes that abduction is a speculative grasp of unknown phenomena, where reasoning involves the formation of new explanatory hypotheses. So instead of ever getting a solution, you just move on to another problem or another parameter, right? As pragmatism speaks to a sociality, get it, through which rules are constructed through the creation of new hypotheses, not to solve a problem but to define one, the image of thinking here is both experiential and experimental. I mean, it's based on what's happening, the experience of the machine, the experience of users, and experimental, of course, because you're always speculating, befitting the way algorithms are using data. And probably the way we do, too, but who cares about us right now? That is socially mediated use of data. I take Parisi to suggest that we have to rethink thinking, which in the algorithm is not reason, but also is not sheer instrumentalism or mechanism, a rethinking of the quantitative in relationship to the inherent indeterminacy or volatility of the algorithmic in a sociality of use. Now, I love that That's her idea. I wish it were mine. I think that's a huge, huge idea. That we're not somewhere between reason and mechanism, or better, reason and instrumentalism. I mean, bye-bye Adorno. I'm joking. We'll never say goodbye to Adorno, although, I could try a month off. But, this opposition between instrumentalism and reason has dominated the way we think philosophically and our criticisms, our social criticisms, our political criticisms. It's risky, and it's not that there is not still reason, but that we think this machine is making that opposition more intense. It is not. Or it's changing it. So, which points to, in my mind, new bodily formations, part of the changes in governance that regulates or better modulates an effective financial capitalism, giving rise to new emanations of populism, population racism, sexual and gender abuse, war, precarity, incarceration, immigration, and deportation. Where do those all come from? That have long histories which have always been intertwined with quantification. Quantification was practically invented for measuring bodies in slavery before control societies, so to speak. Histories which have always been entwined with quantification, mostly statistical, but which now face a post-statistical, post-probability, speculative calculation, and therefore also links to new bodily formations to which I will return. But first, I want to explain what I refer to as a sociality of use. So one of your mandates about difference in our talks here, I am struggling a great deal with, of course, recognizing that all this big data and quantification has led many critical theorists to think back to how long it's been going on in certain populations. And so words like non-human, object, everything they're difficult. You're forgetting how those are used. So, of course, I understand that and have written about it, but I actually think we mustn't keep us from thinking something might be changing in measure and quantification, that it isn't so much that it's ever been there, but that it's here in a profound kind of way as an infrastructure of governance. And we might, all those movements based on the body is organism. Even though it's interesting, often we use something that's not so much about the organism in a way, it's about the skin. So I'm going to get back to that, not always, but I am going to get back to it. I take up the term user, drawing on two sources, one, Ben Bratton, and the other, Wendy Chun, both contributing to some sense of the sociality of the use of data. Bratton, in his recent work on software and sovereignty, describes what he calls the stack, or the accumulation of all other attempts, successful and failed, to solve problems faced by computational technologies that are productive of other technological developments. He has a theory that they move along through mistakes and a little bit like pragmatism writ large. How am I doing time-wise? Not because I have a lot more to say, but I was going to read something. I think I will. I'm good?
10 more minutes and then questions.
10 more minutes. Okay, good. Computations that are productive of other technological developments. It is a way to think about the technical arrangement of all the layers of computing and the contradictory and complex spaces that have been produced in its image, the image of the stack, assemblaging human and other than human actants, both of which Bratton calls user. As Bratton sees it, the user is becoming central to every layer of computing. That is to say, as various layers of computing bind various polities to them, let us say a school, a city, a police force, or molecular molecules of energy, each actant in these various polities is addressed as a user or as actant in a circulation of data that makes being a user what counts, whether that be human user or, as it is more often, a non-human user. Think of something like bots, of course. The point here is that the user's data is accessed, identified, and measured by the very mechanisms that users already use in their living. This is the social use of data, where the data taken from the user's use of data means that the user is inextricable from its data or the data of that polity to which the user is a part or the data of other users. So you can see that's what the sociality means. More than Bratton does, Chun focuses on the human user. However, she treats the user as a you, the you of YouTube, a figure as I see it, that composites the I with its cloud of data traces as a node in a network or many networks of data, including planetary data. Taking up social media, Chun points to the way social media have shifted sociality from the separation of the public and private spheres to what she describes as a separation of the personal and the network, a part of the contraction and massive dissemination of privacy in these times. Of course, like the separation of the private and public spheres, the separation of the personal and the network is more a separation instituted in its transgression, such that the you of social media is by definition ceaselessly invited to disavow that the personal is inherently networked. The endless talk of leaks and privacy as if exceptions are rather the necessary noise in the network, making preferable, if not necessary, that users disavow that the personal is networked or disavow that the I is inextricable from the networks of data which the I in part constitutes through giving off data and in part is constituted by such data. That is, again, the social use of data. As the I is composited with its own data traces, as well as the data fed forward to it from other than human actants beyond conscious cognition and even bodily-based affect, the subject, I would argue, is both humanly and other than humanly embodied. An embodiment within and beyond the organism, within and beyond the skin. This is the I, or subjectivity of the user unconscious. Before saying more about the user unconscious, and I might not get to say it at all, I want to say something about skin. In his work, Bodies in Code, Mark Hansen has drawn on digital media artists and the psychoanalytic theory of Didier Anzu's work, The Skin Ego, to argue that the skin is the first wraparound the infant that holds psychic bits together, allowing for a surface both as a means to distinguish inside and outside and as a medium for an effective circuitry from outside to inside, constructed in the touch of the infant. For the infant, this touching touch experience holds within it a gap between the two, the tiniest time gap, which Hansen describes in terms of an originary technicity, the body's openness to technological modulation, the modulation of touching and all other bodily sensibilities. However, Hansen would go on to consider what he refers to as a world skin, or the flesh of the world, to use Merleau-Ponty's term, and sends us back to what I was talking about at the start, as affect at every scale of matter, rather than just in the body as organism, what Hansen would call the affectivity of a worldly sensibility, increasingly, I am almost done, recognized by us with the data of planetary computing, allowing us to recognize the less immediate touch of the world as a constituent of the human and giving us a speculative fiction for thinking bodies other than the body as organism, and for rethinking thinking relevant for the human and the other than human body of the user, here of course not just the human user, being based in part in the sociality of data use. So the data use, that social, also brings to us something from the outside and is affecting our relationship to our skin as the only boundary between us and the outside, as there's other dynamics starting to affect us. All this can only make us keen to note the implications for thinking a politics of difference, of race, gender, sexuality, age, and ability. All these are usually linked to the body as organism as well as to an idea of the natural environment. That is to say, the body as organism and what we have taken as the environment are now the sites of a shift in critical concern, a shift from confused boundaries of, let's say, the cyborg to a critical concern which is about the incalculable, the openness to volatility in all networks linked to the algorithm production of datafication, making us more aware of the other human actants that are the speculative, empirical condition of possibility of human experience. With that, I can end with a few thoughts about the user unconscious and psychoanalysis. I want to note the relatively recent thinking among psychoanalysts about what Freud described as the drives. For him, a discussion of energy in terms of homeostasis seeking thermodynamics. You remember Nirvana. The relatively new thinking about the drives instead turns to affect, and I would say information theory, noise and volatility. So for instance, Jean Laplanche has argued that affect is the force of the unconscious, driving us to try and try again to translate what he describes as enigmatic messages of parental figures implanted in the infant with the touch of the parenting ones, on top of the baby's own touch, carrying, as the touching does, their unconscious desire, their histories of desire, unknown to the parenting ones as well. So there is no final or true translation of these messages. This affective force drives us toward the objects that I mentioned earlier of the untranslated, untranslatable messages vibrating with affect or energy. Those are the objects I mentioned at the start of my talk. But affect is not only a matter of the human scale. That's what I was suggesting. There also is the affectivity of the other than human, the liveliness of objects beyond human consciousness, cognition, and perception. Taking the other than human liveliness of objects into consideration, I want to suggest that the user unconscious is a matter of affect in these psychoanalytic terms. The force driving us to objects, the force of objects in untranslatable messages that are operating, however, in a networked environment of objects that are not so much lost to us as psychoanalysis would have it, but rather are lively with an affect out of reach of human consciousness, cognition, and perception that is an environment of the endless availability of the search. This endless searchability, this endless translating the untranslatable, now supported by datafication, suggests an embodiment of the I and the unconscious that is human and other than human, and that is only now being fully engaged as a matter of subjectivity and sociality. I think I'll stop there. Yeah, I will.
Questions?
Where'd you go? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Feldman, for the talk. I guess I saw Benjamin Bratton speak a little earlier. I saw Benjamin Bratton speak a little earlier in the year, and he spoke similarly about this sort
Who?
of Benjamin Bratton.
Ah,
And he spoke about this sort of decentering of the human. So I guess as we move to understanding that we may have been maybe entering this sort of descriptive era where the human is no longer centered, how do we avoid, I guess, some of the normative consequences of that move as people maybe dispense with humanism altogether?
Oh, never mind humanism, not about humans. You know, it's just more important than, who cares about humanism? Well, yeah. I'm working on some thinking about how we think about the psyche-soma. You know, what we're talking here really about separating the human body as we know it, the organism, from a kind of thinking rather than thinking that we're doing the thinking, right? And there's this amazing piece by Donald Winnicott, if you know that wonderful psychoanalyst. Do you know Winnicott? You should know Winnicott, called The Relationship of the Psyche-Soma to the Mind. It's kind of like a takedown of Descartes, without ever mentioning Descartes, because Winnicott's so smart. But he says that for the baby, the only reason that they ever, he says there is no such thing as mind. The only reason a mind happens is when the psyche-soma is not supported by the environment, and that the baby has to start thinking a lot. They can't just relax. Sorry, I started chewing my gum and it's sticking in my tongue. And it's not just sort of able to sort of rest in the environment and maintain that relationship. And so I'm trying to really think out what is environment right now. You know, what are the boundaries between the human organism? See, we think everything in terms of this. My skin's the boundary, the nation state, the economy, and it's just not happening. It's not what's going on. It's not going on in the economy, it's not going on in the state, it's not going on in governance. And so there's something about the diagram that datafication's making possible. Is it dangerous? Oh my goodness, of course, I didn't mean to imply it wasn't, but it's going on in a way that one of the things we want to think about, for instance, is what is thinking? You see, we might be able to do something like rethink thinking without, while we're thinking about what are the damages in doing that. You know, it's not exactly like cutting off our arm. You know, it's rethink thinking so that we're not sort of critiquing at some level that the world isn't functioning at, which has always been an interest of mine, that you might be making a critique where that's not where the level of critique should be. And so it's not just the decentering of subject in discourse, we're actually getting reformulated as bodies. You know, not just, you know, what's going inside our bodies, what we think more and more of a completely digitalized environment. You know, I was going to read to you this morning in the Times, it says, there's a big fight going on between China and the United States over the 5G system. So we're beginning to be a prototype system. What consumers will notice immediately is that this network is faster. Data should download almost instantly, even over cell phone networks. It is the first network built to serve the sensors, robots, autonomous vehicles, and other devices that will continuously feed each other vast amounts of data, allowing factories, construction sites, and even whole cities to be run with less moment-to-moment human intervention. So, I'm familiar with so much work on smart cities that say, it doesn't work, it's terrible. And I always say, that's great. They're getting built anyway. I mean, it's a real problem because the determinations of those due to capitalism and geopolitics of sorts isn't about whether they can't work, because they'll be made to work or they'll be made to work better. See, the whole movement is from present to future. It's not looking at things like what's been, I'm talking about the diagram now based on the way the algorithm is working. Do you see what I mean? It's sort of metaphorizing it. So I don't know what, the implications are profound. We're just beginning to even understand what any of that means. All of us, even smarties, but even people that are working in the field don't quite understand what's exactly going on. Because, so what should the intervention be? Well, I think we have to really rethink how we're doing a lot of things, how we're learning, what we're using, how we're thinking, what is the body, what is the edge of some of those definitions too? Because how will it affect people that are not on the edge, who are, and because it is the case, will be left in another place than the leading edge of those technologies, although I'm not sure that we even know that. What is center and margin? Capitalism is so interested in anywhere, Life and living in your house with your mother is not so interested in anywhere, but it may get more and more interested in anywhere. Who's reproducing the babies of the future? Who's reproducing babies? Yes.
That description of the, thank you for the talk. The description of the child or infant environment
Yeah.
coupling and the emergence of the mind out of the imperfection of that relationship.
You know Winnicott?
No?
No, you just followed what I said.
Yes. Well, because what that sounds to me like that external womb of the environment is what the vision of the smart city is.
Yes.
This sort of
Yes.
to lull us back into the non-thinking relationship to the environment.
Right.
And so the critical thinking about that, the productivity of the imperfection in that relationship for, I think, our critical faculties.
Well, it's interesting how you did that, right? So Winnicott says we shouldn't need I really have been puzzling over this. Winnicott says we shouldn't need a mind if everything is working in the environment. And of course, he says mother because, all animals say mother, but, it's environmental. So you said, so if you go to the smart city, it's trying to reproduce that, lulling us back into losing our critical faculties. You've assumed there that the smart city is already part of mind. You understand what I mean? It's already for imperfection. Because you could have gone the other way. You could have said, we never needed mind, so the smart city is perfect. It's making us have what we need.
Yeah, I don't think that.
I know, but you see, you had to make a turn in there somewhere. I'm all with you. I know the turn, but I'm interested in what it means to turn on that thought. That's why I'm trying to work it out a little, and yeah. Who will find, and what is the critical faculties that we're losing or being lulled back into? Look at all the assumptions and the privileges we give to the notion of critical faculties. It's hard to say we shouldn't have critical faculties. We shouldn't have critical faculties, right? What did that mean? I am asking you and myself to speculate about a diagrammatic shift that we haven't quite gone through, but are going through. Maybe we should stop it. That's, I'm all for stopping trains.
Well, but just as a follow-up, I think that one of the things that would happen in this sort of abstracted version of the lulling in the relationship is that if you're lulled in that womb of the techno womb of the smart city, I think one of the problem with that is you're unable to see how the womb doesn't work for a lot of people, right? It works for you, and that's what you become blind to.
So let's clarify further. Winnicott didn't mean womb, he meant after you got out.
Sure.
He did. Because the comfort of, and not lulling, because for him, if the environment is supportive enough, the child actually learns and becomes creative and playful. It's when the child isn't supported enough that he gets a mind, which for Winnicott's not so playful, and is too much, it is broken off from the body psyche, right? So you could make an argument, and I have been forced to think, that that mind broken off from the psyche and the soma is the smart city, right? Is that smart-minded place. But I want to make sure I have thought that all the way through in order to understand what the smart city might become. Now, the other question we always ask is, yes, but who does it leave behind? Yeah. So, you know, when a diagram is changing, if it is, and these are, you know, like painfully difficult questions, because what makes a diagram change? You know, the post-structuralists never said capitalism makes it change. Well, because it wasn't, it's a dynamic of energy. That it's going to be about capitalism, of course, and about power, you know, think Foucault. But it isn't what makes it. It isn't the only agency that makes something happen. Because some of our models of who's left behind have to be thought too. There are people being left behind or not doing well, let's put it that, or hurting, or whatever we want to use. What words do we want to use? If, for instance, capitalism, so you're shaking your head, is everywhere. It's everywhere and creating strata that are doing really well and stuff, and like, you know, a lot of other people who aren't. So it isn't just geographical like that. I mean, we have to keep on rethinking what's left behind me. Well, left behind means that we're thinking we're supposed to be making progress. I don't even know if any of this is progress. It's a change, right? So, and are they left behind because of their bodies? And what is a body? You can see why I've been trying to think everything. That's right, I have it. You know, what is that configuration that makes the human body what it's been making it? And with the human body, the population of body. Population already in Foucault and population racism was already about statistical bits. You know, not really about the body in that way. So, yeah, those are the right questions, of course, you know. I certainly like thinking differently and thinking about the body differently. Most of us are going to, if not already, have things that don't belong in bodies. I hope I'll have them because I don't, you know, plastic things or things that hold your heart together or whatever, or, you know, whole different genetic stuff, you know, that's outside the body, that seems like it's inside the body, but is really outside the body, putting back in the body, doing all sort of things, you know. I'm not sure we ever were just an organism. Organism theory is really based on autopoiesis, which is all about reproducing the functioning of the organism. So it's really against boundaries being broken into, and if they were, you die. So this boundedness is also something we should be really thinking about, and has caused great trouble for people. Not all people, but some people. So there's something to think about. I think it's great to think about the unconscious and even to try to think through psychoanalysis, because then you get a space of something, like it wasn't very clear in this, but because I just wanted to say a new body. And so I want to move Winnicott, of course, and want to say if the human body is already, you know, is already other than human, that there are living other objects with it, then what is mind? Is it, you see, I want to do the whole thing over. because I really think psychoanalysis could use with a doing over. Always can, always can. But the unconscious always has meant that the unthought. So that's the other thing that you're asking me. And sometimes when you're listening to Luciana, which I know you have, it's like, oh, that's great. And you think, what didn't she think about? Oh my God, a lot of things, right? So it isn't just what you don't think about, but what are you not able? Foucault says that science, there's something you can't think in order to do it. So I don't know if I find some of your questions a thing I can't think. There might be something else I can't think in thinking what I'm thinking, and that's to me a part of the unconscious as well. Yeah.
I used to think that algorithmic productivity was mostly about either rationality or convenience. So either things that we didn't trust humans to do because they were too subjective and we wanted objectivity, or just labor that we didn't want to do, sort of calculations, whatever.
Right.
But I now think there's a third category, which is sort of like we're now expecting a sort of algorithmic contribution to affect, and either because like in Syrian Cortana, we sort of want that like secretary feel. I'm writing a paper on secretaries in AI right now, so it's sort of like it's on my mind, but also this sort of like anxiety, a perennial anxiety around automation and algorithms that we're expecting. We expect like a sort of human veneer. Like ATMs were given a woman's voice because there was a concern that they would be too startling or anxiety-ridden for people to use. So if they were given a woman's voice, then people would be more likely to use them. Like, how threatening can it be if a woman is like voicing this thing? So as I was listening to your talk, it sort of struck me that like a combination of critical theory plus psychoanalysis is actually a really great place to start from in a consideration of algorithmic affect. Agree or disagree?
Agree, why?
I don't know. Something about like the vocabulary. I mean, it's been a while since I've had to do critical thinking about psychoanalysis. Like I did a gender studies degree
Of
at the
course,
moment
it's
when
a long
everybody
time
had
ago.
to. Well, yeah. But sort of the idea
Because that's
that
a body.
right.
That's
Well,
more
because
that
what we're replacing,
organism.
or like the thing that the first two categories, the body doesn't really matter. I mean, it does. Body always matters. But like the fantasy of AI when it comes to rationality or when it
Okay,
comes
now I
to
got you.
convenience,
Yeah.
the body doesn't sort of drops out, and that's
And
okay.
that's the idea we all think.
But when
Digital
it comes
is
to
disembodying
affect,
us,
it's
right.
sort of like the reinsertion of the body becomes more inevitable,
Yeah.
And that's why things like Syrian Cortana are coded as female as a default, right?
Right.
Feminine as a default.
Right, but the body there, what body is that voice having?
I don't know, but it has a long history of just like
I mean, is that-
subjugation, right? So
The voice has a long history of subjugation, but that's a partial human body and a partial something else. It's a girl voice, but let us say, and that's kind of interesting, right? That you now have a technology, because I can remember studying cybernetics, one of the most difficult things they couldn't imagine getting done was voice recognition. It was really hard. And I can remember those professors saying, "It'll never happen." Well, they were at a limit.
it's ridiculous
But-
to laugh at it now.
But it's yes. It's very interesting though. I'm pleased with what you said, because I didn't understand it first, but I liked it, is that the move of the piece, and I thought it kind of, the middle got a little hard. I have to relook at that, but to understand. The move of the piece is from this concern about the human body and digital, which is kind of amazing because people have always thought the digital was disembodying. But anyone that spent hours in front of their computer started to realize that there was more than, we weren't thinking a lot, let us say, we were emoting or we were feeling connected, right? Effectively connected to someone, something. And then we lost it again with it being the cognition. And that's the unconscious I'm returning to, exactly as you put it. Could have done that faster. That there's an interesting way to rethink the body now that we think that algorithms have cognition. Yeah. And why does it have to be our body only?
Right.
And I didn't want to take you all the way through, but, and that's probably why the middle got weird while I was reading, because I cut it all out, is all of Mark Hanson's work on the planetary data, our sensibility about the planet and about how things are going on in the environment are all coming through big data and are coming, from outside us in as another, where'd he go? He went to the book place, he left his book. Another kind of environment. So I had that on my mind too, it was too much to talk about. Our sensibilities to larger environments than just, our body really.
Patricia,
You
did
have
you have a
one?
question? Go ahead.
Yes,
Can we move to the third world a bit?
can't hear a thing.
Um,
Not because of you, I can't hear a thing.
The third world context, because we know that the third world, particularly in poverty, is famed for having no mind or close to the environment,
No what?
like no mind,
Oh, yes.
right? The lack of mindfulness or close to nature, or they don't really think. But we know that under very extreme poverty and the bursting of technology, people are using social media. There's maybe more.
What do you think about that?
I don't know. I want to hear what you think. From a post-colonial perspective, how do you? Because it unleashes a huge amount of energy that is subconscious,
Yeah.
never been coded,
Yeah, it's
and now it's
interesting.
combining
Yeah.
the two.
Well, I mean, there's some easy, engineering answers, which I would not go too far with myself, but, it's easy to get a phone there and not easy to get all the other technologies we had before. There's, the infrastructure is so much easier. So there's still huge numbers of people who don't have cell phones. I'm always surprised when I read those numbers because you forget that we don't talk about. So it was easy to get them there, though, without having to do an enormous amount of it. But, this recent argument of the United States with China, who has the capacity to do 5G, which is this new system that will be hugely faster. And people, this is another thing, once people think somebody's got that, the article actually went on to say this is a war. War about who's going to control that, because there's so much control over information, and there is not a single military device for war that isn't digital now. So whoever has information has a lot, right? So what do I think about that? Well, I think it's part of what I was thinking before, that we'll have to be careful. We should have always been careful, probably, about thinking where margins and centers are, and what's periphery, or who has it and who doesn't. Not that isn't a thought, since people still don't have it, but not by those simple definitions. I mean, capitalism is, if it's moved from getting surplus value, from laborers using their energy and going home and get fed by their wives, to just direct use of energy, as you put it, that's coming off of us as data, which we're always doing. It's just that it's getting captured now. Your body's always doing that, right? Or your body and the environment, or your body and all the other people in your community. I like the social use of data too, not just the planetary, but the way Parisi talks about it. So it's interesting what capitalism is doing and what people might care about that, or how that in the long term, there was a moment we thought we were going to have Twitter revolutions everywhere. So, what it really means. But it's interesting, right? Because it sort of plays around.
Well, it's 5:30, so I think we'll wrap up there, but please join me in thanking Patricia.